Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton, but where to get great prices on gifts they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and low prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
Sean Bean and Connie Nielsen star in Robin Hood. From Sherwood Forest to the Norman Court, a classic tale reborn for today. The story continues to unfold. New episodes Sundays on MGM+.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have a big extravaganza for you today. We have a panel discussion of the top 15 commanders of the Napoleonic Era. I'm so thrilled to be doing this episode and sharing it with all my listeners. We have the who's who of Napoleonic experts joining us today. Hello, everyone. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we have 5 terrific guests on the line with us today. We have the great Rachael Stark. Hello, Rachael. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yep. Bookish Rachael on Twitter. She's my Marshals expert. We have the great Jonas de Neef. Hello, Jonas. I'm very good. We have the brilliant Graeme Callister. How are you, Graeme?
I'm very well, thanks, John. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. We have Major Mike Hamel joining us from West Point. Hello, Mike.
Hey, pleasure to be on.
Yep. And finally, last but not least, the great Nick Kramer from the University of North Texas.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me on. Good to see you again.
Yep. My pleasure. My pleasure. So what we're going to do today is we're going to each present our list of the top 15 generals, commanders of the Napoleonic era. We'll, of course, have some debate after each person gives their list. That's kind of the structure of it. So we're going to kind of go in order. Ladies first, of course, with Rachael going first. But before I get into that, I do have a little disclaimer I have to do. The opinions expressed herein are those of the individual and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Army, U.S. Military Academy, or the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Okay, glad I got that in there.
Appreciate that.
Okay, before we get into that, I want to make sure I give a shout out to anything you guys have coming out or you're promoting or anything going on. Rachael, do you have anything new or exciting coming out? I know we have your Marshals blog still on WordPress.
Yeah, sorry, I'm the sort of least qualified one here. I'm just here by virtue of being a Marshals nerd, so nothing to promote. My actual day job is business lecturing, so nothing very glamorous.
No, sounds glamorous to me. Jonas, I know you have a great blog, right?
Well, trying my best, but trying to get eyewitness accounts from officers and soldiers translated from French to English and making them accessible, as some of them are quite rare or came out of print or just worth mentioning more often. So I try to collect them there, and please have a look over there.
And you just rebranded your blog, right? You got a new logo there.
I got a new logo going. I think also maybe look-wise might have a change soon. So, but mostly it's mostly content that's going to keep on expanding. So keep an eye on that.
Okay, yeah, look for it. Napoleon Chronicles is the blog, and I recommend that. Graeme, what do you have going on?
Well, at some point there will be a book on conscription coming out. Still being written at the moment. But if you want to catch up on my work, you can see bits and pieces online. I had a book out last year on Waterloo that has actually been called the best thing ever written on Waterloo. Called that by me, but nonetheless. It's a book on first corps attack at Waterloo. So if you're interested in this very specific bit, you can get that. But yeah, it's the conscription book that's underway at the moment.
Very good. Nick, do you have anything cooking?
Other than cooking away at my dissertation on Prince Schwarzenberg, not really. It's quite I just got back from Vienna doing research for the second year in a row, so still got 30,000 photos and documents to sift through, so that's a labor of love and passion, but it's been very fun.
Okay. And Major Mike Hamel, do you have anything that we should know about coming up?
I just had an article come out in the War Studies Journal, Volume 2, which I'm pretty proud of. But other than that, that's the most recent thing.
Okay, very good. To my listeners, please support and follow all these fine guests wherever they are on their websites and books. I would very much appreciate it. Okay, now we're off. So how this is going to work is each of us has a list of 15 commanders, generals that we're going to list without interruption from the other panelists. After they're done with their list, we, of course, will add commentary. Full mocking, insults will be accepted. Belittling is fine, whatever you feel comfortable with, or, accommodation. Like maybe one of our lists will match up perfectly with someone else's. I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens here. But yeah, we're going to start off with the ladies first. So we're going to start with Rachael Stark. And then once Rachael is done, we're all going to kind of chime in and then move on to Jonas after that. So Rachael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I said we were chatting just before we started. I did sort of say the proviso. My probably does have a fairly hefty Marshal's bias, but I've tried not to be completely blatant. I've kept my top 5 the same, but I feel like I've changed everything else about a dozen times this week. But I'll take you through the current list as it was, because we were, again, saying before we started, great, such a subjective term, and depending on the lens through which we view them and view most of these men, we could rank them God only knows how many ways. We could be here for days. So I've kind of gone for battlefield competence, command ability, consistency, leadership, and strategic impact. So my number 1 was probably not very surprisingly Napoleon. It kind of has to be, doesn't it? He's era defining, not just for the various remarkable victories that he has, although there's plenty of them, but because he in so many ways kind of reinvents the art of warfare. Use of massed artillery, corps level maneuvering, rapid concentration of force, and so on. The first Italian campaign's kind of like the high bar, isn't it? I mean, it just stands in a league of its own. Obviously, I'm not speaking to the ethics of him, but his multi-theatre dominance of Europe for so long, the ability he had to maintain that control is pretty extraordinary. And even after he was defeated, his fingerprints are kind of all over so much of what came after. And even in defeat, things like the retreat from Moscow, catastrophic though it was, what he did manage to control and what he did manage to still achieve, even that was pretty remarkable. So I think whether you love him or loathe him, and people invariably are going to do both, nobody commanded with so much strategic vision or sheer audacity as he did. And I think that's exactly why people are still drawn to him, 200 odd years on. He just is the era defining guy. My number 2, and I think he's a fairly worthy second, I have to say, is Wellington, Napoleon's ultimate adversary, even though they never really directly meet until right at the end, or at least never directly fought each other. And while Napoleon's like this effervescent like flash of brilliance, Wellington's not that. He's not a glamorous, charismatic personality at all. He's a fairly cold fish. But what he is, I think, is Mr. Steady and Consistent. He is the ultimate professional soldier. He is reliable, he's determined, and before he comes at me with a pitchfork, I know he wasn't just a defensive general, but I think he's a defensive master, absolutely the master of defensive command. He excels at choosing his ground, choosing impenetrable positions. He forces the enemy to break themselves against him. He fights intelligent warfare. And really importantly for me, what I think he can never be accused of is holding life cheaply. And probably that's something we could charge Napoleon with. He achieves great victories, but I don't think he always necessarily reflects on the human cost of those victories. Wellington doesn't waste people's lives cheaply, and he's sometimes called cautious for this, but I think if you're one of the people who is involved in those battlefields, you're probably quite glad your life's not going to be spent without good reason. His excellence shines in the Peninsular War, although his career was established before that. He wears down the French through calculated campaigning, logistics, sheer professionalism. And obviously, outside our sort of little coterie of nerds, he's best known for Waterloo and being a very bad prime minister. But he has some really spectacular victories, and amongst all that as well, things like I say earlier on in his career, things like obviously Salamanca as a triumph. So Not necessarily the most glamorous of men, but probably the ultimate professional soldier. And very much in a similar vein, for number 3, I've got my guy, Davout. He was going to be in my top 3, undoubtedly. I couldn't really justify putting him any higher, even though he's obviously my number 1. I am steadfastly Chief Davouti, and celebrator of antisocial baldy-gits. But of all the marshals, and we've got some really big characters in amongst the 26, and obviously myself and Graeme and John have been involved in a Marshal Davout over in the Napoleonic pod. He, for me, is the greatest of the 26, and probably not very dissimilar to Wellington. Not glamorous, not particularly friendly, but superbly competent, ultimately professional, always where he needs to be, exactly when he needs to be there. He's one of Napoleon's most reliable subordinates. Ironclad integrity, no looting, no thievery, no unnecessary inflammation of the population, never decisively defeated, detail orientated, and the sheer fact that it's when it's Davout's men finally break in Russia, that's when people say, that's it. His men are the indicator of all that is good in the Grande Armée, and that's down to his discipline, his logistics, his detail orientation, and the sort of high expectations he has for his men. High taskmaster, but that reflects well on his corps. He's got triumphs to his name, obviously, at Erstadt, but also Eckmühl. He plays key roles at Austerlitz, Wagram, Eylau, and he was trusted with independent command, as are quite a few of the marshals, but he excels. And it's only really down to his nigh miraculous efforts as Minister of War in 1815 that there really even is the French force that there is at Waterloo. So yeah, for me, a man of ironclad principles, as well as iron determination and very high quality professionalism. And then my number 4 is a man who's basically Davout's antithesis in every way, apart from the fact that they're really both flippin' talented, and that's Lannes. He is brash, he's mercurial, he's temperamental, he's charismatic, he's brave, and he's one of the most tactically gifted of the marshals. If Davout's the iron spine of the Grande Armée, Lannes its heart. And it's really interesting, well, certainly for my ranking, he's the top one who doesn't have a military education. You know, Wellington, Napoleon, Davout, they are trained for the art of command. They are trained to be military men. Lannes is somebody who we would in modern parlance say he's working class. He comes up from nothing. He's one of the poorest educated of the marshals. You know, some people derisively say he's barely literate. And yet he becomes this phenomenal commander on sheer innate talent. He's incredibly, personally brave. He sort of personifies everything about the revolution. Somebody who's come from nothing, who has got themselves there on merit. He's obviously very beloved by Napoleon. He's a friend. But he leads by example. He inspires. He's charismatic. He gets people on side. He's the kind of man you would want to follow. You know, he's obviously got great victories to his name. He's present at things like Austerlitz, Friedland. What he does at Aspern Essling is decisive, even though it ultimately ends up being his last battle. He's never a yes man. He's very happy to tell Napoleon to bugger off when he feels it's justified. And that was necessary. He needed somebody to speak truth to power. And he always got away with it. It's a mark of how much esteem Napoleon held him in. He once flounced off on unofficial leave because he felt he hadn't got enough credit. And he got to do it. And, he came back when he felt he'd had his leave. And his loss devastated Napoleon, and it's really one of the big, amazing what-ifs to consider. Had he not been lost when he was, what might Lannes have gone on to do? Would we, have seen more triumph? Would he have turned? It's a really, really interesting, consideration. My number 5 might be controversial. I've gone for Massena, who I know has a career of, very much peaks and troughs. Certainly towards the end. But I think at his peak in Italy, he's a general who we might have conceivably called Napoleon's equal. He is a brilliant general at his best. again, like Lan, no military education, no privilege. He pulls himself up through talent. Gets himself ahead also by stealing quite a lot of stuff. He's an inveterate looter. There's that amazing passage in Oudinot's memoirs where their wives are talking in the retreat, and Madame Massena says to Oudinot's wife, how much money have you got, kept aside, like how much have you got in the boot of the carriage? And she rattles off this amount that basically makes Madame Oudinot's jaw drop, because they are so wealthy, because he's stolen basically everything that isn't nailed down. So that does kind of go against him, but I think his innate brilliance kind of can't be doubted. You think of things like Rivoli, Zurich, his heroic resistance at Genoa, and how that helps pin the enemy down, where they're not elsewhere. Napoleon calls him the darling child of victory, and I don't actually think that's too hyperbolic. He really was, at his best, bold, aggressive, at that time indispensable general, obviously let down through his performance in the Peninsular War, but crucially, I think we could say in his defense, he didn't want the command. He felt like he'd done his duty, he was getting old, he wanted to just be at home and enjoy his enormous fortune. He was strong-armed into doing it, and that brilliant career begins to decline. But I do think at his best, for me, he's a worthy number 5. 6, I've got Suchet. I ummed and ahed quite a lot about where to put Suchet. This is like not the highest he's been. I also had him down at 13 at one point. He comes to the fore obviously slightly later than the others as a marshal. Obviously as a general, his career goes right back. He actually worked very closely with Massena in Italy. And I am acutely aware he gets a very different billet in Spain than the other marshals. We're never comparing apples and apples here. But I'm ranking him high for sheer effectiveness and political savviness. The marshals weren't necessarily all a very politically savvy bunch, but Suchet kind of has the insightful notion that maybe if you're going to pose as liberators or overlords, or however we're going to spin it, maybe if we come in and oppress and we behave brutally, people aren't going to like it very much. And he actually, he uses his heart and minds campaign, and it works. I mean, most of the marshals struggled in the politically hostile environment of Spain, but Suchet adapted. He was a very adaptable general. He doesn't just govern. He does win battles, but he held his territory. He pacified regions. He administers with skill and with integrity. Again, one of the marshals who you could look and say, well, his conduct actually holds up. His campaigns in Aragon and Catalonia are examples that he effectively integrated not just military governance, but battlefield competence as well. So pretty good. And then I'm one more marshal, and then there is a break. And it's Soult. And he's the marshal that I sometimes think doesn't get the credit he deserves. I sometimes think the Peninsular War turns into a bit of a stick to beat Soult with, almost unjustifiably. It gets overdone. His contribution, I think, sometimes is undersold. He's one of the big organising generals, not necessarily one of the flashier personalities. Very methodical, detail-orientated, capable of handling pretty big logistical burdens. Good tactician, and there is that quote from Wellington about he turned up in a battlefield and then he never knew what to do with his men when he got there. But I think sometimes that's too harsh, and I know it's semantics. I don't think it's so much that he lost in Spain as that he failed to win in the environment he was operating in. I think none of the marshals, it doesn't matter who we put there. I know people go, if you chucked Davout in, it would have been different. I don't think any of the marshals could have ultimately have won Spain. His campaigns in Portugal and the Pyrenees do show his ability to operate independently and under pressure. Obviously, famously made Chief of Staff at Waterloo, he probably would have been better suited to a battlefield command. But he is one of the generals with the most tangible legacy post-conflict. He obviously serves as Prime Minister of France several times and enacts some significant military reforms that we can still see in place today. And then I'll pause with the French. Sorry for my blatant pro-French bias, but then I've got Archduke Charles. If Wellington's the ultimate adversary, maybe we give him credit for being certainly one of the earlier figures who manages to hold their own against Napoleon to some degree. He reforms, obviously, the Habsburg army into a much more modern fighting force, not alone, but he's a significant player in it. And he leads them to some of their best performance in the conflicts. And really notably, obviously, as Asper and Essling, he kind of gives Napoleon his first check. And I think psychologically that's quite important as well, because people, including Napoleon, were starting to believe his legend. He is Fortune's favourite child. He's undefeatable. There's nobody who's going to win against this guy. So actually being able to perform that check, hold on, this guy isn't going to win decisively every time. I think that's got psychological impact as well as the physical. Again, not necessarily very glamorous, sometimes framed as a bit cautious, but I think he's got a deep understanding of operational warfare and plays an important role. My number 9 is Barclay de Tolly. Not a very popular man in his lifetime, God bless him. Viewed as overly cautious and, foreign, goodness forbid. But I think he does deserve a space on the list because his decision making, loathed as it was at the time, plays an ultimately significant role in the defeat in 1812. His strategic approach was pivotal. It was his idea to kind of trade space for time, pull Napoleon deeper into Russia, deny him that decisive battle that might have completely turned things around, ended the campaign in Napoleon's favour. And that decision helps, obviously, as we all know, cripple the Grande Armée. And he returns to command, obviously, later in the wars. He's highly competent. He's a very good coalition commander, which not all of the very good generals necessarily were. Some of them are really poor collaborators. So he's very quiet. He's very considered. He's analytical. And his decision-making, obviously, ultimately was vindicated. Number 10, I've put Kutuzov, another Russian. Suvorov's very noticeably missing on my list, and that's because I've kind of stuck to the Napoleonic conflict rather than pre-Napoleonic revolutionary France. So it's not that I've not valued the man accordingly, it's just I've stuck to that kind of time frame. So I've gone for Kutuzov, obviously a much bigger personality than Barclay de Tolly. Oversees the unraveling of the Russian campaign. His choice to withdraw after Borodino, to abandon Moscow. Again, see, a lot of these decisions are controversial, and I think it takes a very different kind of bravery, from battlefield bravery, to be able to make decisions that are ultimately so unpopular because you believe it's the right thing to do. Not a tactical genius, certainly compared to some of the guys on this list, but he understands context very well. He knew when to fight, when not to fight, when to be patient, and that level of patience ultimately pays off in the end. And of course, as a symbol, he's got value. He becomes almost like the embodiment of the Russian resistance. Number 11, I've got Blücher. Again, using the proviso, I understand this man is not a strategic genius by any stretch of the imagination. Aggressive almost to the point of recklessness on occasion, and that aggression pays off. What he brings to the table is this sort of raw, almost manic energy, a fighting spirit, this unrelenting drive to defeat Napoleon. He was not going to have Napoleon triumphant so long as he had breath in his body left. Helps reform the Prussian army alongside Scharnhorst, and I always mangle his name, I'm sorry, Naizo. And obviously famously plays the critical role at Waterloo. Had he not arrived when he was supposed to, or when he was most needed, potentially the battle itself, if not the campaign, might have ended differently. Then I'm back to France for number 12. I've got Marshal Davout, who is a really interesting character. If any of the marshals could be psychologically analysed, I would love to see what somebody would make of him. He's cerebral, he's cold, he's awkward, he's an absolutely terrible collaborator, not particularly nice subordinate either, but a deeply analytical general, and that didn't always necessarily endear him to Napoleon. Again, somebody who was not a yes man. He was adamant for a good chunk of his career that Napoleon held him back because he didn't agree with Napoleon enough. But on campaign, in terms of his battlefield competence, is very, very strong. His manoeuvring in Germany and Italy, again, shows that level of sort of subtlety and patience and understanding a context that not all of the marshals had. very, very good at defence, a meticulous planner, and it would have been interesting to see what might have become of him if he'd gotten his marshalate earlier. Obviously, one of the later batons, if he'd had independent command earlier, would we potentially have ranked him with Davout and Lannes? Who knows? Then I've got Ney, and he had to be on the list. He, again, a bit like Lannes, typifies everything about the Grand Army. Yes, his decision making could be erratic. Yes, his performance could be the same. He could perform brilliantly. He could cock up brilliantly, and he usually redeemed himself pretty quickly. But for charisma, for inspiration, for the sheer legend that he becomes, he is to be on the list. He's one of the people, if you know nothing about the Napoleonic Wars, you probably heard of obviously you've heard of Napoleon, you may have heard of Wellington. Even then, people still tend to know about Ney, the Marshal of France, who gets shot at the end of the conflict for turning against the king. The guy is a living legend, and I think for that level of impact, emotional impact, for the ability to inspire people, his rearguard effectiveness, yes, we can talk about his decision making in Russia for sure. Could anybody else have held out in the way that he did? Have got his man out in the way that he did? I'm not sure they could have. So yes, he's not as high as some of the others, but my God, what an absolute giant of a personality. And then 14, very different sort of personality. I've gone for Rowland Hill, who I am very, very fond of. And, Wellington wanted if something happened to him, command should go to Hill. And I think that's everything. Wellington's not a man who's particularly effusive in his praise. And Hill is, again, one of these people who is not a big dominating personality. There's certainly more flamboyant British generals under Wellington, but he's calm, he's steady, 100% reliable. Again, one of these people you could trust to know, to be where he was supposed to be, to do what he was supposed to do, when he was supposed to do it. Often operated in detached missions in the Peninsular War, sometimes commanded huge amounts of the British Army, always performed well, not a particularly innovative general, maybe not a strategic innovator, but he was the kind of leader that any good commander wants on his flank. And I also think, and again, this is a very biased statement, but when I look at this list that I've pulled together, and maybe some of the other personalities we'll talk about, we've got a lot of great men. I don't think great and good are necessarily always synonymous. Massena's a great general, and he stole everything. Soult was a massive looter. We could go on about quite a lot of them. Hill was a great man, and he was also a very good one. And I think that's an important distinction to make as well. And then lastly, I've got Eugène, Prince Eugène, Napoleon's stepson. I think if Napoleon had quite a few more Eugènes and a few less Jeromes and Josephs, he'd have been admirably better served. He grows into his role in Italy, and in academia we talk about exit velocity. When a student comes out at the end, we look at the improvement in their grades, and for me, Eugène kind of typifies exit velocity. You see how he grows into his competency as a commander throughout the conflict. He shows steadiness, he shows maturity in his decision making, obviously very personally loyal to Napoleon, much more so than his own blood relations, and he was very steady in the face of very difficult odds. During the 1812 retreat, he performed admirably. He kept cohesion after Murat cleared off to look after his own interests. He's not a military genius in the way that his stepfather was, but I think he's a very steady, thoughtful commander who matured under fire. And I do think if he'd had a few more of Eugène and a few less Bonapartes, Napoleon would have done a bit better. And so endeth the list.
At Burger King, when it comes to value, you make the rules. Introducing the You Rules of Value. And you rule number 1, you choose food you actually want. With 7 tasty options, you can have it your way. Try the $5 Duo or $7 Trio. From BK Classics to Fan Faves. Choose your deal. Price and participation vary. U.S. only. No substitutions. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
A little applause. That was amazing. Great job, Rachel. Gents, I'm kind of blown away. I totally forgot Eugene on my list. Now I'm like rewriting my list as we talk. What do you guys think?
Well, there's certainly going to be some debate. I'll say that. My list is different, but that's a good thing.
What do you think, Jonas?
Yeah, actually, my list is quite similar. Only maybe 2 or 3 different names in there. And now that I think about it, maybe I'm kind of regretting it, or maybe I'm going to put them together because I just feel they're so interchangeable. The arguments that Rachel made, they can work both for and against in certain cases. So Eugene is also quite a good pick, actually. Quite underrated. Someone who really came into his own, starting from 1809. Very capable in Russia. And then 1813, him technically being like the last defense, holding off the Allied thrust. So yeah, it's quite amazing. And then his years in Italy, keeping everything afloat.
Yeah, Graeme, what do you think?
I think that's a really good list. Again, there's going to be huge crossover, I think, with a lot of them. I thought I'd be the only one to have Eugene on my list, to be honest. So there goes my thunder. But no, I can't really dispute any of them. There's some that, like Barclay de Tolly, I'm not a massive fan of. I think he kind of rewrote Running Away into a really thought-out strategic retreat, but equally he then stuck to it, and with Scorched Earth it did actually work. So, we'll give him credit. I don't think I've got him on my list, but, I understand why he would be there. But I think I've been a bit less French-heavy maybe, but I also understand why he would be French-heavy, because this is a period of a series of colossi in the French army. Now, these generals, these marshals, the men that Napoleon builds the army around, are superb, independently and collectively. So I absolutely understand that heavy French bias up front. Again, there's a couple I don't have on my list. But, I've got a list of 15 that couldn't make the list of 15 who you think should be there. So no, I really like that list, and I really like the explanations for each person as well.
Yeah, really detailed. Major Hamel, what do you think of Rachael Stark's list?
Yeah, I was hoping to have some sort of debate here, but I think 12 of the 15 are on my list as well. I didn't put Hill on my list. I mean, I really like him as a general. I love him as an officer. He's a great case study of how you should lead men and how to be a good officer, but also a competent one. I just don't think there's really any good independent victories to his name. He was always kind of playing against the B team. So if I was going to take umbrage with anything, it's that. But at the same time, I'm not mad at him being on the list.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. So that was good stuff. Yeah. Like Rachel, you blew us away. Really good stuff. Really good details on each one.
There's only one omission that not necessarily any of us, but a lot of people would take umbrage with, is why no Berthier. Not a great battlefield commander, but I mean, a lot of people would argue that without him, the army doesn't function at all. Full disclosure, I have him pretty low compared to a lot of other people, but just want to hear your thoughts on why you just straight up excluded him.
So the only reason I've put Berthier not on my list is largely semantics, but I think if we were going to argue most indispensable commander, he'd be number 1, because he's indispensable to every French victory. He's the organizer, the architect thereof. But I feel sometimes with Berthier, his genius is that he translates, that he is a conduit for Napoleon's. I think if you sum up Berthier, if you think of that sort of quote in the Sherlock Holmes story, the Bruce Partington plans, everybody else is a specialist. His specialty is omniscience. That's Berthier for me. But his genius is so tied up in Napoleon's. They're like this symbiotic double act. Napoleon's the strategic visionary. Berthier is the man who actually makes it happen. He sits to me almost like a little aside. He's the most indispensable officer of the entire Grande Armée. But if we're ranking generals on, as I say, things like battlefield competence and consistency in under fire, things like that, it's the only reason he's not on my list. For indispensability, he's number 1. He's peerless among staff officers. He's the staff officer, the man who kind of sets the bar. But I feel like his great role is as this sort of working partnership with Napoleon as an independent general, which is how I've ranked all the others. I don't think, again, we're comparing apples and apples. He's a very different stamp of officer, and that's the only reason he's not on my list, because he's an absolute powerhouse.
Good call out. Okay, so now we're going to go to Jonas. But just to switch it up, Jonas, could you do yours in reverse order? Could you do 15-1?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, it was my list is infinitely long. If I could have done it. Mostly, there's also a bit of a French bias here, but I did my best to give the Allied commanders their credit where it is due. I kind of worked in bubbles, because I just in between these 3 bubbles that I have of 5 each, I feel they can be quite interchangeable given context, personality-wise. There are things to be for and against about. So I'll start with the lower 5. Barclay de Tolly. Basically, for him to kind of mastermind this plan for the withdrawal for the Russian army in 1812 specifically, can be argued that it was the right thing to do. It wasn't liked during the period, especially also by his fellow Russian-born commanders. It was still the good tactic to come up with, and that in collaboration with Tsar Alexander, which is kind of sidelined. It's actually quite fascinating. Then I would go for Blücher. Also kind of like Rachel pointed out, he's just that firebrand personification of that Prussian resistance, almost kind of like a Prussian Ney in a way. Maybe a bit foolhardy, not maybe the cleanest of track record, but eventually when that drive was necessary to get France within its borders, in the later years. I mean, given also the fact that the beating that he got initially in the early 1814 campaign, and then still managing to get his men follow him and be consistent is quite commendable. Then I have Archduke Charles, very methodical commander. Went against a lot of voices at Austrian courts, still making his own, reforming the Austrian army mid-war. Is also actually quite astonishing given how much terrain that the empire lost. Dealing with a multinational army is also maybe a factor that we should focus on. And the Austrian army in that regard is a bit underrated in my opinion. Then I would go for Ney, basically a deep personification of the Grande Armée when it comes to, especially to bravery. So that's my pick. And then on the top of that lower bubble that I have, I did put Berthier, because I do kind of feel like the administration part of the French army might not be as interesting, but how to translate Napoleon's mind onto paper and distributing it, and basically also like the whole the study of the État-Major, the French État-Major, is actually very interesting. Shows how the army functioned. Doesn't get a lot of credit, so I would put them on the top of that lower bubble. So that second bubble that I have, lower end is I have Kutuzov. Mostly in the way how he kind of represents the Russian army. In a way, as in rallying it together when this this huge invasion, especially for 1812, how he can personify that resistance is actually quite formidable. Also, very much a mind of his own, can go against his fellow commanders, but he sticks through to the end. Is very commendable. Unfortunately, dying in 1813 would have been a great what if for how the 1813 campaign would have continued and so forth. Then I have Lannes. Although he is competing with 2 other names that I feel could be interchangeable, because I have Suchet and Soult. I can make a bit more of a case for Suchet, where I feel he's people know him, but I still feel when it comes to his governance of Catalonia, Aragon, there's actually a great study done on him by Yuan Kim, which I can highly recommend to read, where he shows where, although, there's maybe a little bit of a misconception where he led, but he could lead with an iron fist. There's like the case to make for Tarragona, where the garrison was was really put to the sword. But he would use those instances to really make his name, and then come back to the negotiating table with Spanish locals and the administration to make that Napoleonic rule there work and make it more or less acceptable. And this is something that I feel most of the other marshals and generals in the Peninsular War didn't really get a real catch on, even though some of them were vain. You have Soult wanting to be king of Portugal at one point, Murat keeping an eye on the throne of Spain. At least for Suchet, there's a lot to commend for that. He actually knew how to be a good administrator and a political leader. Then on top of those three that I mentioned, I would put Massena, especially if for his track record, especially in the early years, in the revolutionary period, what he did in Italy. Very good stuff. Kind of like also what Rachel mentioned before. Once the age catches up on him, he's, especially when he's thrusted into the third invasion of Portugal. You can kind of tell that he doesn't really want to be there anymore. And while he has to work with some of the commanders that aren't necessarily very willing to follow him, he still could make it work, and he gave Wellington a hard time up till Torres Vedras. And Fuentes de Honoro could have turned out differently if the coordination would have been more optimized, especially with Bessières, for instance. Then I go for the top five. Again, spot number 3, I can basically put like 3 different names. Very hard to decide, but if I go for the French side, it would be undoubtedly Davout, given he's also really a personification of proper conduct. Like his corps can almost be put on the same level as the Imperial Guard when it comes to administration, how it's run. The commanders that he picks, a lot of the names on the general list that I made are from Davout's corps, throughout his career. So, it just shows how he had an eye for, picking men that are also very willing to follow him, but are also willing to follow his type of administration, his type of rule, his type of style of command. So then that makes him quite a household name. Then I go for 2 allied commanders, Suvorov and Nelson. I must say I'm not very well versed into the Navy side of things, but when it comes to him putting his name on a lot of French defeats, against the French Navy, he knew the name well. Basically, what he did on sea is just as commendable as having several army corps going about doing their things. So it is quite phenomenal what he did, and with the highlight, especially Trafalgar, is definitely worth mentioning. For Suvorov, it is kind of a big what if for me if there would have been a direct clash with Napoleon, how that would have figured out. But especially, I think Massena, in particular, he got a good sense what Suvorov could do. Thinking about all the battles prior and building up towards Zurich, I think they're very commendable. Men of the cold steel, which is also quite astonishing to see in this type of warfare. And also, his earlier career too is also quite fascinating to see how he went up against the Ottomans in going against odds that are quite astonishing, and still making it out of there is it's quite interesting. Then the top 2, although with a bias, like I said, for France, Napoleon is an easy spot to allocate him to. Just personification of this period. His name, whether you like him or loathe him, people will still read his biographies first and delve into other details of the Napoleonic period and the Revolutionary period as well. So that personification is very praiseworthy. And now he revolutionized the state, as a leader. Very interesting things to look about. Then, whereas Wellington, as mentioned before, he's kind of like the antithesis, quite aloof, but a man of logistics. Gets its grapes here and there in the peninsula when it comes to siege warfare, but I mean, siege warfare in general isn't the easiest thing to do. But basically, like a better personification for the British Army, pretty much everyone will go to that name Wellington. So that's my take on things.
Very good. Applause for Jonas there. Nice work, my friend. Yeah, great list. Really good stuff. Good sidebars on each one. What did you think, Rachel?
Nothing to argue about. Chucking in a naval commander is pretty inspired, I think. Yeah, I hadn't really considered putting Nelson in, but yeah, I 100% agree with everything you said about him. And I think our lists were so similar. There's nothing I could argue with anyway.
What do you think, Nick?
I mean, yeah, just to echo what Rachel said, great list. Good job putting Nelson in there as well. I don't have him, but more the military side. I'm still interested. The first, Rachel and Jonas, you both had Barclay de Tolly.
Mm-hmm.
My research focuses on him as well, but he's a subordinate to Schwarzenberg in 1813 and 14, and he's not the most popular guy. Not also the most obedient, kind of likes to march to the beat of his own drum and kind of counterintuitive to what the Allies' best interest is. So I have a little bit lower view of him, but he still should deserve, like you guys said, deserves a lot of credit for 1812, even though he's not very popular amongst the Russians. And also the fact that he's able to sideline Alexander in 1812, which is good for the Russians, and I bet if Prince Schwarzenberg could do the same thing in 13 and 14, he would have loved to have sidelined the Tsar as well. It's good to point that out.
I think if I can make a point with that, I find it quite surprising that you feel that when it comes to abiding to Schwarzenberg's command, I find it quite interesting because, both of them, basically when it comes to working out the Trachenberg plan, I would assume that Tolley would have been quite a supporter of this kind of plan where, you basically, try to draw in the marshals, but not necessarily Napoleon. What would be your comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's the best way to work is because in 1812, whenever you avoid Napoleon, it seems like good things happen. But I think also you got to consider, a lot of people are in favor of a more aggressive campaign, especially the Russians, is because you just fought a whole year-long campaign in Russia, which devastates the countryside, and then you fight in the spring of 1813. So, yeah, you kind of want the war to be over as quick as possible. And by pitching a plan of, we're just going to avoid battle and we're going to starve them out. And that's not very popular because that takes time and you've just fought for a year and a half and thousands are dead. So you can see why you'd want to end it quickly.
It makes sense because up to that point, Kutuzov wasn't actually also not really keen to cross the border because he felt that, as much as a victory as it was for the Russians, a lot of lives on the Russian side were lost. So how to get all those forces back and then drive in the heartland of Europe, that would have been quite a challenge. They make it work, but Kutuzov wasn't really a fan of it, and he actually kind of felt that if a push forward could actually trigger the Allies maybe turning on them at a later point because they might be tapping on the table a little bit too much on the negotiating table and so forth, on the side of the diplomatic side. So yeah, it actually makes sense.
I think it's also worth mentioning, 1813 is fought in Germany. This isn't Russia. So what do you really have to gain? I mean, yeah, you obviously have stuff to gain, but also, is it worth sacrificing thousands more lives for Germany? Especially in southern Germany is very loyal to Napoleon, because a lot of those princes in Württemberg, Baden, Bavaria, the King of Saxony, they gained a lot of power, a lot of influence from being under Napoleon's rule. Are they German? Yeah, but under the Holy Roman Empire, you didn't really benefit a lot from that rule. So the fact that Napoleon, yeah, he's French, which may not make a lot of sense today. It's like, oh, well, why are you taking orders from a Frenchman? They gained a lot from it. So are the Southern German princes going to be on board with it? And especially in 1813 and 14, there's a lot of what ifs and a lot of things to consider that the Allies don't get a lot of credit for considering, but Kutuzov, Detali, Metternich, all of them, they deserve a lot more credit for dealing with all those ins and outs as well.
I agree.
Okay. Graeme, we have you back, so that's good. I lost Graeme there temporarily. So hopefully that's resolved, and we're going to plow ahead now. We're going to allow Major Mike Hamel. He's going to give us his list, and we'll see what we learn on this one.
All right, so a lot of my list is the same as y'all's, but there are some different ones. Start off with 15, maybe somewhat controversial. I have Augereau. And I say this because, no, he's not some amazing independent commander, but I think at the division level as a subordinate commander, he's really supreme at that really in-depth tactical level. Not a lot of people know about his exploits in Spain in 1794. He takes his division of about 4,000 men, slips over the Pyrenees, over goat trails for 10 hours. And then he pounces and destroys the single cannon foundry that had been keeping the Spanish army supplied. Captures all sorts of stuff, and then he stays there. Not really sure why he stays, other than, he says he's going to do it anyway. And he makes de Gaumier, the French commander, a little bit salty, because de Gaumier is like, hey, don't be all there exposed. But then when the Spanish attack him with a force that was more than twice his size, he defeats them in detail. And so, I mean, hats off to Augereau. He is the proud bandit. He did looting things, but I think you could say that about half of his marshals. I love the bold defensive style, and he's not somebody who usually makes this lists. Number 14, I think this might be a new one. Bagration. I don't think he gets a lot of credit. He's one of the masters of the rear guard. He shows that in 1805. He shows that again in 1812, where he does lose about half of his men, but he protects the main Russian army. And I think if he doesn't die in 1812, I think he shows a lot of success in the following campaign. And he just has a lot of tenacity and operational daring. So maybe that's a little bit different. 13, I'll go with him a little bit, is Murat. Now, one of the main reasons he makes this list is for his hair and uniforms. I love going to the Louvre. I've been a few times, and I go down the Napoleon section, and you can immediately pick him out based off his hair and his uniform. But more than that, he has legendary courage, and he is just master of the horse, and he's probably one of the best cav commanders of all time. Plays a huge role at Austerlitz. His pursuit at Jena is legendary. And of course, at Eylau, he saves the army. He leads a charge of over 10,000 horsemen. And he is actually an effective reformer as a king of Naples, and he's largely popular. Now, he does have a lack of strategic acumen, probably politically disloyal, somewhat impulsive, but I love the aura, as the kids would say. Moving up to 12, Barclay de Tolly. And I'm actually relatively a fan of de Tolly. And I don't want to repeat anything that's been said. I think we've said a lot of things. But I will say he's one of those guys who has a lot of success in the Finnish War of 1808 to 1809, which I will put as part of the Napoleonic Wars. And he leads his army across 100 kilometers of the frozen Gulf to attack Sweden directly in the winter. Very audacious, could have gone wrong, but he pulls it off. I think he performs well as commander in the Sixth Coalition. And I personally think a lot of the hate that he gets is he wasn't very popular in the court. He has Scottish and German ancestry. And I still think, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on him as more sources are opened up. And it's certainly somebody, if you ever talk to the Dr. Mikaberitsa, he has some really good insights on him. Number 11, Sewell. I think he is a master tactician. I think he's a superb organizer and administrator. And he does have a lot of early military prowess. Everyone else has already talked about a lot of what he does. As was said, he gets a lot of hate for his performance in Spain. But I very much agree with Rachael that I don't think it matters what marshal you put there. I don't think they win, because by the time Wellington is pushing in, Spain's a secondary theater. They don't have the best troops. And this is a side tangent, but I think Spain is relatively easily conquered if Russia doesn't kick off. Large parts of Spain were pretty passive. Had been pacified, and it's not really until the French pull out of Spain for Russia that everything really kicks off. But I'm a fan of Sewell. Number 10, Suchet, for all the reasons we've been said. In addition to, he is a master of siege warfare. There's a number of sieges in eastern Spain between 1810 and 1811. And he's really a master of pulling those off. Also, he's really exceptional logistically, and I would just say he's somebody worth to be studying if you're trying to study some counterinsurgency. Now, he does have some notable military defeats. So once again, he's kind of in the middle there. Moving up to number 9, Isnay. Yes, he isn't the smartest, but I love him, and he is master of the rearguard action. And looking at this from the perspective as an Army officer, the rearguard action, at no matter what level you pull it off, it is the hardest maneuver to carry out. And he does it time and time again. He's excellent in the 1806-1807 campaign. He is a little bit insubordinate in the Peninsular War, but I think his rearguard action in Russia is exceptional. And I know he gets a lot of flack for his performance in the 1813 campaign, and it's deserved, but in his defense, I don't think he's the same officer and same general, the same marshal that he is after Russia. I think he has a lot of baggage after that retreat. He's no longer the same commander, but the bravest of the brave, he has to be on my list. Number 8, maybe somewhat controversial with some people, I have Massena. He's just brilliant tactically, as Rachael was saying. Like, Second Battle of Zurich in 1799 essentially knocks Russia out of the coalition, and he is, unlike a lot of the other marshals, he is a master of independent command. And has already been said with the Peninsular War, he didn't want to be there. He tells the emperor he doesn't want to be there. He tells his officers, this isn't verbatim, but he pretty much says, hey guys, I don't want to be here. I'm old, I'm tired, but the emperor says I have to be here, so I'm here. And even if you're going to criticize him for his invasion of Portugal, he does pretty well. And then Wellesley just hides behind the walls. And, it's a scene out of Monty Python. It's like, come down from the walls and fight. And then Wellesley says no. So I don't know what he's supposed to do. There's nothing else he could have done better. Number 7, Lon, superb tactical acumen. Battle of Montebello. He has 8,000 guys. He attacks and routs the Austrian army of 18,000. At Friedland, his 5th Corps hells off pretty much the entire Russian army for hours. And like some of the other people on my list, highly effective and an independent command. And yeah, he does have a volcanic temperament, to be said, but I think that chills out a little bit over time. Some financial impropriety with spending a lot of money on uniforms, but I would say a lot of the marshals have some issues with that and corruption. So number 6, so maybe this is where there's going to be some debate. So I have Blücher. Yes, he's very aggressive, but I think that's what was needed at the time. And I think his single greatest asset was just his refusal to be broken by defeat. And that's what the coalition needed. And while often reckless, his aggressive spirit was just vital in coalition command, because time and time again, the coalitions had been defeated by just being either indecisive or just being too passive, and she just doesn't let that happen. Number 5, Kutuzov, right? Master of defensive warfare and strategy, arguably the savior of Russia, pragmatic and cunning. I think a lot of where people would rank him lower based off the catastrophe at Austerlitz. And I know he was kind of the de jure commander of the combined Russo-Austrian army, but he advises against attacking the French. And I think had, anybody listened to him, maybe Austerlitz doesn't happen. And he's often accused of being passive and indecisive, but aside from being late in his career, I think a lot of those accusations aren't really valid, because by the time you hit 1810, 1812, how many armies has Napoleon defeated? How many coalition wars have been lost? And so when you're going up against Napoleon, I think it's good to be a little bit conservative. Number 4. So this one might raise some eyebrows. I have Archduke Charlie. Okay, just hear me out. Right. First one to defeat Napoleon in a major battle, Aspern-Essling. And yes, Napoleon did make a lot of mistakes by crossing one bridge, but he did win. And I think you have to look back further as to why I ranked him higher. If you look at his Rhine campaign of 1796, it is a masterpiece. He's using central position and he's maneuvering, defeating 2 superior French armies separately. And I think he is also a groundbreaking military reformer. A lot of the reforms obviously aren't completed by the time they're really needed in 1806, but he does push them forward, and he was working against the institutional inertia of the Austrian army and the Austrian court. And once again, yes, he's conservative, but I don't blame him. I'm not saying he's the best commander. I think he needs more credit than he usually gets. And then the top 3, there's not a lot to be said. Number 3, the Iron Marshal Davout, legendary corps commander. I'll just say at Austerlitz, he covers 70 miles in 48 hours, which is absolutely insane to me as somebody who's done a lot of ruck marches. And I think Austerlitz is the greatest military victory of all time, and that does not happen if Davout doesn't pull it off. There's so many other accomplishments to his name. Number 2, as much as it pains me, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. I don't like him as a commander. I don't like him as a person, but massive strategic impact in Spain by forcing France into that protracted secondary theater. He wins time and time again. He knows when to withdraw. By the time he actually faces Napoleon, Napoleon is not at his best or using his best troops, but ultimately, Wellington is Wellington for reasons. And of course, number 1, Napoleon creates the operational level of war. He's studied to this day. I'm teaching a class on him next semester. I'm not teaching a class on anybody else, so he has to get my number 1.
This episode is brought to you by Nature's Bounty. Nature's Bounty believes your body is brilliant, naturally designed to thrive, inside and out. For those always looking for new ways to support your health from head to heels, Nature's Bounty has a range of over 400 vitamins and supplements born from 50 years of trust and care. Nature's Bounty. It's in your nature. Visit naturesbounty.com to learn more.
When cool, creamy ranch meets tangy, bold buffalo, the whole is greater than the sum of its sauce. Say howdy, partner, to new Buffalo Ranch sauce. Only at McDonald's for a limited time.
At participating McDonald's.
Very good, very good. Okay. Graeme, are you more appalled with Archduke Charles at 4 or Blucher at 6?
Well, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but I'm not particularly appalled by either. No, I really like this list. There's some people on it that aren't on mine, but again, we can't get everyone in. I think Suchet sometimes gets a lot of credit for, well, he obviously gets a lot of credit for Spain. He deserves that. But I'm not as convinced by Suchet as a battlefield commander. As you mentioned, in sieges, counterinsurgency, he's actually quite politically savvy, but as a battlefield commander, not so convinced. I'm not going to give any spoilers of what's on my list of who else isn't there. But some really interesting ones on that one. I think Blucher being that high is a really interesting choice. But as you say, he's the right man at the right time. He does what is necessary. I think some of his campaigns are inspired. The move from Wavre to Waterloo on the 18th of June is often just put off as he marches to support Wellington. He is marching across the axis of advance of someone that's just beaten him 2 days before, with his army strung out on the march to go to the assistance of someone who promised to help him 2 days before and didn't show up. This is a colossal risk he's taking, but he pulls it off. His aggression is there. His willingness to work with someone else is there. So I think Blücher, give him a lot of credit. I maybe wouldn't have him at as high as 6, but fantastic. So it's another list I really like. I really like the reasoning. I can't fault any of it particularly, even if mine will be slightly different.
Really good point on Waterloo and Blücher's efforts there. Jonas and Rachel, you've already gone. I'm going to go to Nick last because he hasn't given his list yet. But what did you think of Mike's list?
Yeah, I love this list. Not to spoil my list either, but I have Charles high as well. Okay. For a lot of the reasons you have as well. I think it's also going to be worth mentioning that he's not the guy who's defeated in 1805. Spoiler. But yeah, I have Charles high as well, so I'm glad that somebody else does. Blücher, having him pretty high. I also have him in my top 10 because he kind of typifies like the later Prusso-German tradition, just very aggressive, and that's what was needed, especially in 1813 and 1814. But everybody remembers him as aggressive, but he's also he sticks to the plan. And yeah, sometimes he charges blindly forward, but there are other opportunities where he could just charge right at Napoleon, and they're like, no, and he doesn't. He retreats, follows the Reichenbach plan. So he's very tactically and strategically in lockstep with the plan, but he also just like the inertia of the coalition is with him. Clausewitz would call it like the center of gravity. That's with his army. And Napoleon chased after him the most because Blücher's got kind of the emotional capacity, and the fire of the coalition is with his army. So I think he deserves a lot of credit, and he deserves to be high up on the list. Although a lot of people might not think so. I agree with Michael. He deserves to be up there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just respond to that. Now, Nick and myself are probably a little bit biased because our advisor, our master, Dr. Michael Legere, did write, Blücher, Scourge, Napoleon. But I think a lot of how people think about Blücher, it's based off previous misconception. I think Blücher, yes, he's aggressive, but it's calculated risk. And I think he has a much better grasp of military strategy and the operational art than he's been given credit for. He was nicknamed Marshal Forward, but right, if you read the book, to plug that, he actually retreated more often than he attacked. And so when he is going forward, it is a calculated risk. And so I'll defend his position.
All right. Jonas, what'd you think of that list?
Pretty good, pretty agreeable on a lot of things. Maybe, although maybe I can't really go into a lot of the details, but maybe something doesn't really stick well with Murat being so high up, especially maybe when it comes to, I think there's like a bit of an aftertaste with 1812, where I've been reading a lot of the eyewitness accounts, and where you feel like a lot, especially his cavalry forces are just being thrown into a lot of situations where maybe caution would have been a better option. But I mean, yeah, benefit of insight here. Yes, a superb cavalry commander, but I can actually kind of feel that there could be some generals of division out there that I actually put on my list that are a good match for him when it comes, especially for the coup d'oeil. I mean, if you have people like La Salle or Montbrun, Kellerman, I even have Discours de Sainte-Croix, which I feel is very underrated. Like, life cut short, but I think he could have been some good martial material. I think they can tug on Murat's coat, if you know what I mean. I mean, Swagger, Audacity, quite interesting. Especially, I feel in the later years, he kind of loses oversight of grand strategy. I feel, especially in 1812, like I said, I feel there's quite some eyewitness accounts out there, some material that, kind of made the argument that, he would lose the oversight and it would cause a lot of death and destruction for little good reason.
Okay. In all clarity, Marshal Murat is on my list, but we haven't gotten to my list yet. Rachel, what did you think of Mike's list?
Yeah, I thought it was so well argued. Love seeing Ojiro on the list. He's such a great personality. Again, the only one I disagree with is Murat, but then I'm fairly overtly have said on various other podcasts that I think he's a pillock. But again, that's the whole point of doing these things. That's the fun of it, is looking at how many different ways we can look at it and who admires what and how we can, pull out the various characteristics of these men. So it's great to listen to.
Very good.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick. It's almost hard with the list when I was making this. I don't know if you found this, but they're almost different people depending on what war you're talking in. And so I'm not going to argue that Murat isn't the best later on, because he's not. But like when he's great, he's the best. But then he's just not. But just like Napoleon himself, Napoleon at the end is not the same. And you have some glimpses of his old self, and really in 1814, but when it's too late. But I think with a lot of these people, it's like, why weren't you how you used to be? So I'm not going to give pushback on Murat.
Roger that. All right. Well, we got 2 more to go. Well, actually 3 more to go if you count myself. And I think we'll pause here for part 1. We will have part 2 of the top 15 generals of the Napoleonic Age next week. If you like this episode, please be sure to rate and review us wherever podcasts are heard, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much for listening.